Welcome to the Everybody Matters podcast, a show dedicated to the idea that when organizations care enough to show other people that who they are and what they do matter, they unlock the only business idea with truly unlimited potential. I'm Brent Stewart, your host. This podcast is an outreach of Barry-Wehmiller. Don't forget to connect with us on the web at Barry-Wehmiller.com, on Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, on Facebook and LinkedIn, and check out our blog, trulyhumanleadership.com. Recently, Barry-Wehmiller was honored to be the subject of a case study by Harvard Business School. It wasn't the first time we've been the subject of a case study at Harvard, but this one is especially humbling. As you will hear during this episode, the two professors who wrote the case study, Dylan Minor and Jan Rivkin, were looking to write about the relationship between business strategy and people-centric ideas. Fortunately, they thought of Barry-Wehmiller. On this episode of the Everybody Matters podcast, Dylan and Jan talk about why the case involving Barry-Wehmiller is important, but they also dive deeper into how business students respond to truly human leadership and how the principles of conscious businesses are becoming more accepted and widespread. We start out with Jan and then Dylan talking about the case study method and why they looked to Barry-Wehmiller for this particular case.
We teach here at Harvard Business School almost entirely by the case method. A case is a document that produces for the students an actual business problem, and we ask the students to study by examining that problem and asking themselves what they would do. It's kind of a crazy way to teach, in a sense. We even teach things like accounting by the case method. You might think accounting, you should have a lecture, you should learn the rules, but instead we expose them to business problems and ask them to wrestle with them. I think there are lots of motivations and benefits that come from doing that. Maybe the most is the students get accustomed to making actual decisions in the context of all the confusion and complications that every real business problem entails. You know that in business, a problem rarely comes to you and says to you, I'm an accounting problem, or I'm a marketing problem. Instead, it's a very messy set of facts. And our students get a lot of practice kind of plowing through the messy facts, trying to figure out what the essential issues are, and taking action in the face of uncertainty. It's close to real-world experience. Of course, you'd never get the real world in a case. But we try our best to get something close to it. Dylan and I were searching for a case that looked at the relationship between business strategy and people practices. And to find a case on that, we started to look for companies where we thought there was something really innovative or something unusual going on that would provoke an important discussion among students or executives, and particularly would force them to re-examine their own assumptions about how people practices relate to strategy. We looked around at a bunch of companies. Fortunately, Dylan had interacted with Barry-Wehmiller in the past. I learned a bit about it. I learned that my colleague Amy Cuddy had seen the company in the past and was really struck by it as well. So from there, we reached out to the company, and we're very fortunate that, generously enough, the doors would be open to us. We have different kinds of cases. One distinctive kind of case is a case on a company that is doing something very unusual in its own context. I think those kinds of cases work because they force the students who examine those cases to ask, why do we see what we usually see, and how might the world be different? Right? There's a very established set of human resource practices out there in the world. Barry-Wehmiller does something very different, and it seems to work for the company. And that will force, students to ask themselves, what is it about this new approach, or what is it about this context that lead to the outcomes that occur? And that often opens their eyes to a whole bunch of things that they had not thought about consciously in the past.
That's exactly right. So that's the beauty of having this kind of thing in a case discussion, is that, again, it's definitely not, you're not trying to say that, okay, this is a preeminent example, even in the footnotes and disclaimers on the front page of the case, right? It says this is not to be considered necessarily an excellent example of business or, just this boilerplate kind of disclaimer, that really it's a vehicle to discuss these things. And the thing I like about the case and why I'm excited to use it is it forces people to think about, in my view, what I would call bigger questions than just, well, how can I squeeze some more productivity out of my workers? It doesn't mean that they're going to take away that say, they would do it the same way Barry-Wehmiller did it, but hopefully it's going to at least get them thinking hard about, well, how do we think about then, again, how we're treating our people and how we're going to arrive at different kind of performance outcomes. Is it all just about the performance, or should we really be thinking about some of these other factors as well?
So if this is a good concept for a case study, what is the temperature of the audience? In other words, will the principles of conscious businesses and people-centric leadership resonate with today's MBA students? We asked Jan and Dylan to talk about the trends they are seeing today in their classrooms.
So I think we do see more and more students who are very interested in the broader implications of business and their careers. They're asking themselves what's the right role of business in society. They're asking themselves what's the right role for them in business. I think that the notion of trying to measure success in non-financial ways was very appealing and very familiar to them. The actual instance, though, and the ability to see that way of doing business with all of its implications through all the parts of the company, that was new to them. And I don't think they'd see that. Certainly for our MBAs, we see more and more of them concerned about what their careers will mean beyond their financial success.
In the last, not just couple of years, but really the last decade and beyond, that companies are increasingly concerned about engaging in sustainability and corporate social responsibility kinds of issues. And of course, how you treat workers is one manifestation of that. And so, companies are more interested, and we can make different speculations why, whether it's maybe some consumers now are more willing to pay, say, for companies that work in that way or offer products that were created in a certain way. So there's an appetite for that. But then there's the demand side of the workers that companies, at least some executives I've talked to now, feel that if they're able to offer a better workplace, then they're going to be able to get better workers. And even if all they care about is ultimately having a large pile of money to sit on, it still actually makes sense to be thinking about how, for example, you might be treating your workers. So there definitely is a trend. So one statistic I can give you is that companies in the S&P 500, so these are the largest 500 U.S. companies, have started paying almost half of their top 5 executives based on sustainability, responsibility kinds of outcomes, which could be, what are your environmental emissions? What's the diversity of your top executive suite? Whatever the case, could be lots of different dimensions how they measure so-called CSR. But I was surprised to see it's about 40%. Though 2013 was the last year of my data set that I looked at. But over the 10 years, it has grown tremendously where companies, almost none of them would pay their executives based on these kinds of outcomes. Where now, again, it's getting close to where half of the top U.S. companies are actually directly incentivizing their top executives to be thinking about more sustainability, these kinds of outcomes, and not just the financial results. And there's some demographics, like people talk about. I don't have some statistics at the end of my tongue, but I know you could probably look them up on Google in about 30 seconds, find a few good ones. But talking about how, now the millennials, and they seem to care more about sustainability issues and what have you. I mean, there's definitely been a demographic shift where more people today care about these kinds of issues beyond just the pure financial outcomes.
This is my 20th year on the faculty at HBS. So I've had the good fortune of seeing students through some different periods. I also have had, the interesting experience that every year I get a year older, but the students always stay the same. So I always know what 27-year-olds are particularly self-selected set of 27-year-olds are thinking about the world. And it is interesting. There's definitely been, to my eye at least, an increasing concern about the social implications of what businesses do and the measures of success beyond financial success. I'd say that the millennial generation is actually very sensitive to this. I know a lot of business people kind of moan and roll their eyes when they talk about millennials. I actually have a great affection for them. I think that they're thinking beyond their compensation. They're thinking beyond their immediate employer. They're thinking about the world as a whole. Is actually a tremendously beneficial thing for society and for business in the long run. I think it'd be hard to figure a better presentation to millennials than the message that everybody matters, that everyone matters.
As far as the specifics of the case study itself, we can't give too much away. We want this to be a learning tool for generations to come. So here's a brief synopsis of the case, taken from the Harvard Business Review website, where you can purchase the case if you're interested. It reads, "The chief executive of Barry-Wehmiller, a large maker of industrial equipment, has resolved to run the company via truly human leadership, in which success is measured by the way we touch the lives of people. With unusual people practices and a distinctive strategy, the company has generated enviable financial results. During the Great Recession of 2007-2009, the company went to great lengths to avoid layoffs. But as the case opens in 2013, one division of the company faces a sharp downturn, and the head of the division must decide whether to let employees go. In light of Barry-Wehmiller's people practices and strategy, what should he do?" Now, the Barry-Wehmiller company involved is called MSI, and its leader is Ryan Gable. Here's Jan talking about how the case was presented to his students, then Dylan and Jan talking about the students' responses.
We started that discussion with a debate over how Ryan Gable at MSI should respond to the downturn. That quickly turned into a closer examination of truly human leadership and more broadly what accounts for the economic success of Barry-Wehmiller. How much of it is being in the right industries, how much of it is having a great strategy, how much of it is really the people practices, how much of it is around the acquisition processes and practices of the company. That then led into a broader discussion about the implications of truly human leadership beyond Barry-Wehmiller. Was this a universally better way of doing business, or something very specific to the context? And then that all circled back to the decision, where people tried to re-examine their arguments for the right course of action for MSI. And in turn, that opened to a discussion with Bob that was just terrific. So it kind of started with the decision, it went back into the analysis, and then circled back to the decision.
I think you're always going to have a distribution of responses. I think on the one hand that certainly people would like to work at a company, right, generally where you're going to be treated like your family. Of course, one of the difficulties is we've all also had different backgrounds and family upbringings. Fortunately for myself, I have a delightful family and a very wonderful, loving mother and father. And so when we talk about let's have the company take care of their people like a family, to me, that's a very warm, very positive kind of vision and image, where those that didn't have such an experience, I can imagine they wouldn't have that same resonating response. So I think that that alone is one piece of that. And the other piece of it is that some people, and I saw this happen the day Bob was there, kind of have this knee-jerk reaction of the notion that I'm going to have parents, right? Ever since we were high schoolers, we did not like the idea of having anyone that was going to tell us what to do. So when people think of the notion of having more of this almost kind of parental setting in my workplace, kind of reel at the idea, because that to them means, I'm going to have people telling me what to do and making decisions for me, when really I should be making all of my decisions on my own. So I think that's part of kind of the multifaceted response. People are coming from very different places, and so when they first hear this, it's a little bit more of a visceral response as opposed to really trying to articulate exactly what does that vision look like as far as, quote, a company is, treating their people like a loving and caring family, and then stepping back and seeing to what extent does that seem like a good and true thing to do.
I'd say that there was a range of reflections afterwards. I would say there were a set of people who were inspired by the Barry-Wehmiller example and felt they could pull it off. There were a handful of individuals who actually thought it was not for them or their organizations. And probably the largest group saw it as something to aspire to, but weren't yet sure what to do to get off go. And that was indeed probably the most common reaction among the executives who saw the case and wrestled with it. But actually, to me, that was an optimistic outcome. To me, that says they're struggling with the right things. I would say among we're very, very fortunate in our executive programs to have some great cases to teach and to have some fantastic business leaders come to campus for us even. I mean, it's just incredible generosity. I would say that among the ones who came last term, Bob was probably one of the few that they were still wrestling with and scratching their heads over weeks later. So that's a great thing. Of course, our definition of victory for a case like this is not that everyone walks out the room saying, the Barry-Wehmiller way, that's the way for me. The real definition of victory from the educator's point of view is they walk out of the room asking themselves, what do I believe? And it's not the measure of success that they agree with Bob Chapman. The measure of success is that they think about their own assumptions so deeply that over time they come to agree with themselves.
For us at Barry-Wehmiller, our hope is that this case is used to further a conversation about leadership. What is good leadership? And how should companies value their people? We want other companies to re-examine the way they are doing business to make sure it is all centered around people. As we close out the podcast, Dylan and Jan talk about their hopes for the case study and also about the place truly human leadership can have in our current corporate and political environment.
Really, my hope fundamentally is having a vehicle for students to be forced to confront two things. One is a lesser point, and that is you should think about your workers just in terms of developing the strategy of your firm. Like fundamentally, especially more and more today, the age we're in, like your company is your workers, how they're working, what they're doing, their skill, etc. So that's stage one. And stage two, my hope, the larger issue is moving beyond, these aren't workers, these are people. And thinking about, should we also think about our people as more a sustainability, social, ethical issue, and in particular, how we actually treat our people in our firm. So that's the second purpose, and the higher purpose, my hope is, for this case to have a vehicle to do that. And of course, not all students will resonate to that, but my hope is those students and some students will already be thinking that way, but those students in the middle, if you will, that can basically have their eyes open to a different way to do business, that will force them to think real hard about it. And hopefully, my hope is personally that in the long run actually have an impact on how they do business.
The notion of truly human leadership might be might address some of the challenges we see in business going forward. I think we see a profound challenge to the legitimacy of business in our environment right now. The recent election was just one manifestation of it, right? We see that a lot of the outcomes of the way business is done in most places, those outcomes are being rejected by many people around our country. And there are lots of folks out there who I think were voted in part for that reason. to that end. And how do we create a business environment, a form of market capitalism that actually addresses underlying human needs and does it in an equitable way? And we don't have a great solution for that. I think there is definitely a scenario in which market capitalism is a victim of itself, in which the unequal outcomes, both financial but also psychological outcomes of how business is done in many places, causes a rejection of the whole system. The alternative for those of us who believe that business can be a solution to some of the world's greatest problems is to figure out a way that businesses operate such that the tremendous gains that come from the operations of good businesses are shared broadly. I mean, look, the greatest crisis I think we've got in our country right now is the lack of shared prosperity. We're growing, but we're growing apart. We're growing in ways in which a small portion of the participants in our system are reaping the greatest gains. That's certainly true financially, and I think it's true psychically as well. So if we can't find some way to overcome that, we've got some very rough changes ahead. Business and government have lost the trust of a large portion of the population. And to rebuild that trust, the first thing you've got to be actually is trustworthy. And I think the example of Barry-Wehmiller at least gets us one model that we need to think very carefully about.
Like I said before, you can purchase the case study on the Harvard Business Review website. It's hbr.org. We want to thank you for listening today. And if you'd like to find out more about Barry-Wehmiller and Bob Chapman and Raj Sisodia's book, Everybody Matters, The Extraordinary Power of Caring for Your People Like Family, go to everybodymattersbook.com. For updates on the book, the podcast, you get a lot of great content and insight. Don't forget to connect with us on the web at barrywehmiller.com, on Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, on Facebook and LinkedIn, and check out our blog, trulyhumanleadership.com. I'm Brent Stewart. Thanks for listening. And don't forget, Everybody Matters is the only business idea with truly unlimited potential.